Putin calculated in 2021, late 2021, when the decision was probably taken that Russia would invade Ukraine, a full-scale invasion, that the Europeans and the Americans wouldn't do a great deal to support Ukraine in the same way that they hadn't really after the 2014 annexation of Crimea and stirring up troubles in the Donbass. But there's a massive miscalculation on Putin's part. Britain poured in resources, then the Americans, some of the European states too. So, I think the Russians have to project this image of invincibility, but at the same time, they of course have concerns. Western countries could really go for the jugular with Russia. They could actually cause more damage. They could cut Russia off even further.
Hello and welcome to Frontline for Times Radio. I'm Louis Sykes. Today we're joined by James Rogers, the co-founder and director of research at the Council on Geostrategy. James, thank you very much for joining us today.
It's very good to be with you. Thank you for having me on the show.
Well, as has been widely broadcast, NATO is meeting this week at a summit in The Hague. Obviously, there's a lot going on at the moment in global security outside of Europe. Should we expect any significant announcements on support for Ukraine or deterrence against Russia?
I think actually that this summit, because of American preferences, I think that Ukraine might not be discussed a great deal, or at least publicly. I think the American administration has its intentions, and I think some European countries have theirs. And I'm not sure that the Ukraine or Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine is going to feature very prominently at this particular summit. I think instead it's going to be much more firmly focused on the issue of defense spending and also dealing with the American reprioritization towards the Indo-Pacific, and at least for the time being, perhaps towards the Middle East.
And is that going to cause concern in Ukraine, and especially for Zelensky, especially considering the lack of anything significant coming out of the G7 meeting recently?
Yes, I think yes, but also no. I think this is to be expected. This has been clear for some time. I think that actually thinking ahead, the issue of European defense spending, and frankly, in some cases, the pitiful amounts of defense spending or investment in defense that some European countries have allowed themselves to fall to, needs to be prioritized. It needs to be on the agenda. Otherwise, in the longer term, countries such as Ukraine will not receive the support that they need, particularly if the US, or as the US, reprioritizes onto the Indo-Pacific and the Middle Eastern theaters. So, this is a kind of a long-term issue, and actually my view is that Trump is right to push it, because American leaders going all the way back to, George Bush, Barack Obama, they've all made it very, very clear that Europeans and Britain as well need to increase their defense spending and to rebuild their armed forces after the drawdown in the 1990s. And that, if this was not to happen, then eventually the US might refocus anyway. If you remember, Robert Gates gave a very prominent speech to the Atlantic Council back in 2011, where he said quite explicitly that if the Europeans need to step up, that the Atlanticist generation that lived through the Cold War was passing from the scene, that he was in some ways the tail end of that, and that the next generation of American strategic thinkers and policymakers would have other interests looking elsewhere. And if Europeans were not stepping up to the plate, at least to defend themselves, to defend their own region, to shape it in accordance with their preferences and interests, then, well, why should the US do it? It's not logical. So, this is a really important issue. But again, there's no necessary reason why it can't be dealt with simultaneously with the situation in Ukraine, notwithstanding, of course, the situation now in the Middle East.
And President Zelensky is in the UK today. He's visited King Charles. How important is that support from the UK as one of the leading European nations?
I think it's absolutely critical, and it's actually now reflecting or showing a precedent, if you will. Because remember, after that extraordinary incident a few months ago in the Oval Office between Trump, JD Vance, and Zelensky, the day after he visited the UK, and Britain basically rolled out the red carpet and said, and welcomed him to the country, expressed support Sir Keir Starmer, the Prime Minister, then went on to rally European support for President Zelensky in Ukraine. And Britain really was at the centre of attention, and the current government should be congratulated for doing that. Britain has always been, at the centre of attention in relation to Ukraine since 2021 and 2022. But this was one of those decisive moments, I think, where Britain did actually play a key role or part in re-establishing a kind of Western and particularly a European commitment to Ukraine. Now, that's all very well, but at the same time, you still need to prepare for the long haul, assuming that the US is not going to be there in the way that it was initially. And even under the previous Biden administration, it was clear that the Americans were having difficulties to push forward and push through new rounds of military and economic assistance. And in the interim, it should have been very clear to Europeans that they would need to prepare and step up accordingly. Now, the UK, as one of, if not the premier military power in Europe, guarded by nuclear weapons. Nuclear weapons are things that Russia respects. Has a key position here in connecting Europeans and galvanizing support. And this has been helped by the change of government, I think, in Germany, as well as the warming of France towards a more robust posture, as well as a general consensus, I think, in Europe that things couldn't go on as they were, that Europeans really do need to take this seriously. But without those decisive increases in defence investment, then Europeans really will lack the capability, the means to provide for Ukraine, both in the shorter term, let alone in the longer term. I mean, if you look at the figures that we're dealing with here, that European countries have been investing in their military and in their defence forces over the last few years, they're still pitifully low in some cases. I mean, you have, according to the latest NATO figures, Spain spending just 1.28% of its GDP on defence. You have Italy spending about 1.5%. These are still, these are the largest, some of the largest allies within the alliance, within the European component, and they're really not pulling their weight. Now, there's another element here as well, and they were not pulling their weight in relation to the post-Cold War period when there was a relative peace. But this period that we're now moving into, and the Strategic Defence Review made this very clear that we're entering a kind of a pre-war era or an era of profound volatility. The UK's national security strategy is due out imminently. That will probably make very similar assertions. NATO's strategic concept said something very similar, and other European countries have also released similar documents, that we are moving into a profoundly dangerous era. The kinds of levels of defence spending that we're seeing, even in the more adventurous allies, is still not enough. So Poland is currently the leading spender in per capita in relation to GDP terms within the alliance, and it's spending 4.12% according to NATO's latest figures. But if you put this into the context of the Cold War, Britain was spending, it averaged its spending between 1949 and 1989 was actually 6.4%. So, we've still got quite some way to go to reach the amount that's required in order to deter aggressors, particularly those such as Mr. Putin's Russia, which is both unpredictable, but also it would seem very reckless as well.
And how do you think Kyiv will be reading these boosts in defence spending? I mean, is there a worry that if this spending goes up, but it's focused nationally, that it may not actually mean more support for Ukraine?
Yeah, so there's also a bit of smoke and mirrors involved here. So I think it's the case that many European countries, the UK included, have been saying that they are increasing their investment in defence, but in real terms, then they're not, or it's going up very, very marginally. I mean, there's quite a lot of bandwidth in terms of what can be accommodated within NATO's defence spending figures, and governments often throw in all sorts of interesting things like military pensions. We have a situation in the UK where we're now suggesting that forms of intelligence spending account for defence. So if there's not actually any real increases in in spending, that's to say on capability, on the drawing together of those capabilities and their projection to the areas where they're needed, then there are obviously some serious problems. Now that might satisfy Donald Trump and his administration in the US to see the figures going up for the time being. But as it becomes clear that there's no actual increases in concrete military capabilities, or that they are far less than they should be, then I think the Americans will just push, they'll push even harder. And this issue is just not going to go away. It's with us now for the long term until we can get to the level that's required in order to deter the threats that we're now starting to face.
Hmm. And meanwhile, in the conflict itself in Ukraine, we heard Putin last week doubling down on the idea of seizing all of Ukraine. Russia now openly suggesting that they will try to take Sumy in the Kharkiv region. Where does all of that leave the ceasefire talks that the US had been pushing so strongly for?
So, I mean, I think the Americans have been pushing this very, and this is the Trump administration's. I think we've talked about this before. I think the Americans would like to, wrap this issue up as quickly as possible because again, they have bigger issues to deal with in the Indo-Pacific. The rise of China is a fundamental systemic issue for them. The Chinese Navy has grown so fast over the last 10 to 15 years from a small minnow in reality that was basically a coastal defense force to a navy that now has some regional, if not global, power projection capabilities. And as that continues, the balance of power between the US Navy and the Chinese Navy is moving slowly in China's favor. So the Americans got a huge problem there. So they want to see this issue in Eastern Europe and the Black Sea region put to bed as quickly as possible. However, Mr. Putin, I think, doesn't want this at all. He sees it in Russia's and his long-term objectives to continue to push for a maximal approach towards Ukraine. He thinks that he has the capacity, scale of Russia, the military-industrial modernization of Russia, and the amount of resources that they've been pouring into the effort to eventually overwhelm Ukraine. And I suppose simultaneously he's looking at the Europeans, at the Americans, at the potential for fissures between them, both within Europe and between America and the Europeans, including Britain. And he may still calculate or think that time is on his side, and therefore why give up now? Just keep pushing. So that's a serious problem, and I'm not entirely sure that we've come to terms with this, notwithstanding the support that we've been giving to Ukraine to date.
And in Europe, the EU is discussing an 18th round of sanctions against Russia, but the US's own package of sanctions appears to have been held up by the White House. Is there any sign that this outside pressure is having an impact on Russia's capability to continue with the war?
Well, I mean, a really interesting question, and there's I mean, on the one hand, it undoubtedly is having an impact, but at the same time, when a country mobilizes on the scale that Russia has done, and even that isn't towards a full war mobilization, you can still, get around some of these, get around the issue of sanctions, or at least you can mitigate against their effects. So we should expect the Russian war economy or the extent to which the Kremlin has turned Russia into a war economy, which isn't fully the case, but is getting closer to that. It's sort of 7 to 9, maybe 10% of GDP of Russia's GDP is now being invested into the military. Put this into context, in the Second World War, Britain was investing up to just over 50%, the Soviet Union over 50%, the Americans over 40%. This is a true war economy to fight a total war. Even the Ukrainians are not really there yet. The Russians certainly are not there yet. But nonetheless, there are more assets being poured into that, in Russia at least, also in order to prevent too much disruption to the Russian, the way of life. So I expect that sanctions will continue to have a bite, but they're not going to win the war. They're not going to bring Russia to its knees or to the table, at least in the short term. What we need to be focusing on here is more, well, how do we assist the Ukrainians with the military side of things, so that they can both defend themselves against Russia's attacks, but also to begin to strike back at Russia and at range, to put Russian cities under target, to put Russian infrastructure under target as well.
There does seem to be some concern in the Kremlin, though, about the idea of a recession. At the end of last week, Putin said he wouldn't let recession happen and instructed his ministers not to let it happen as well. Surely, even the fact that the Kremlin is talking publicly about this idea of recession suggests they're worried about the state of the war economy.
Yes, I mean, of course. I mean, they have to be, because they want to both simultaneously project an image of almost invincibility, that they can continue going using Russia's industrial and economic resources, which are significant, but by no means to the scale I think needed in order to secure their objectives in Ukraine, particularly as Western countries, as European countries, have provided Ukraine with support. I mean, I think, and we discussed this before, um, that Putin calculated in 2021, late 2021, when the decision was probably taken that Russia would invade Ukraine, I mean, a full-scale invasion, that the Europeans and the Americans wouldn't do a great deal to support Ukraine in the same way that they hadn't really after the 2014 annexation of Crimea and stirring up troubles in the Donbass. But there's a massive miscalculation on Putin's part. Britain poured in resources, then the Americans, some of the European states too. So I mean, I think the Russians have to project this image of invincibility, but at the same time, they of course have concerns. I mean, Western countries could really go for the jugular with Russia. They could actually cause more damage. They could cut Russia off even further, and so on and so forth. But they haven't been willing to do that yet, to the extent that they perhaps could. But even then, if they did that, there would still need to be both that would hurt them as well as Russia, but it also isn't necessarily enough to win the war on Ukraine's side of things. I mean, it requires more military support for Ukraine ultimately to allow the Ukrainians to be at a very advantageous position in the future should negotiations ensue. Now, if the Russians just want to keep going, and that there's the bandwidth within the Russian system, both the economy, the political system, and beyond the military, to just keep pushing, then this could be a very long, protracted conflict that could go on for some years. And then it becomes an issue of, well, who is going to give up first? Will it be the Europeans, particularly if they're left on their own by the Americans and Britain, or will it be the Russians? Will they eventually relent and say this is enough? We can't continue doing this. It's having a significant and damaging effect on our economic well-being, particularly the economic well-being of the Russian economic and political elite, and is there a drag effect, and is it worth it in the long term based on what they might be able to secure from the victory in Ukraine, whatever that might be, or whatever shape that might take, or from gaining access to Ukraine's substantial resources, both mineral wealth, whatever's left of the industrial facilities, and beyond.
And we talk about where there are these gaps in support for Ukraine. A lot of this, of course, has come out of the reduction in US interest and involvement in stopping Russia's invasion. What do you think Ukraine and Europe could do at the moment to bring Trump's attention back to Europe and back to the Russian invasion? And actually, do they really want to do that, considering his input on the conflict so far?
Yeah, I mean, this is again another really thorny issue. I mean, the way that the way that President Zelensky seems to, the Ukrainians have been, trying to manage the situation or shape it, shall we say, is to point to the fact constantly that Putin is insincere, that Trump tried to negotiate some kind of truce or peace agreement, but the Russians, the Kremlin, simply do not want to play ball. To the extent that then the Americans and Trump and the administration realize or understand fully that Putin has no no intention of any kind of peace and wishes to continue with the war. And not only that, but also that kind of stands against Trump's persona and his ambitions to act as a peace broker in this conflict. I think that's what the Ukrainians have been trying to do. We've, I suppose, been trying to mirror or amplify that as well. And there is a possibility, I suppose, along the way that Trump will realize that he's been played by Putin and may then support the Ukrainians far more than in recent months, even the last year or so. However, the Americans still have a key interest, as I said earlier, in what's happening in the Indo-Pacific, and they've now become involved in the Middle East to a greater extent than they wanted to, I think, because the geopolitical reality has forced itself on them. They are a truly global power. And have global interests in all theatres and can't really disentangle themselves easily from any. So is it possible? I'm not sure. This is the issue that Europeans really need to get on top of, grapple with, and take the relevant precautions, which requires significant investment in defence, in the armaments capacity, so that they can start manufacturing the kinds of equipment that Ukraine requires, and really to take the lead, even, let's say, and not expect the Americans to bail out European security, bail the Europeans out again, bail Ukraine out. This is something that European countries, Germany, France, Britain, Poland, Italy, Spain, and others need to take greater responsibility for. Otherwise, this may not end well. And we should not forget that if Russia does prevail, we will be dealing with a far more dangerous Russia in the future than the one that we're currently confronting. The Kremlin will have calculated, if it prevails in some way in Ukraine, it will have potentially calculated accurately that eventually it would use its weight, would use its resourcefulness, its determination to get its way in Ukraine, to secure its strategic objectives, and that the Europeans, Britain, would eventually buckle, and we will then see a proliferation of, I think, these sort of sub-strategic or sub-threshold attacks all across Europe. And also we'll be dealing with a far more dangerous Russia, which will have a battle-hardened army, will have a significant defense build-up underway, and we'll have to deal with a situation that's far worse than the one we're currently facing.
And we've heard Russia deepening a lot of its language in the last week, expanding its objectives again to target all of Ukraine, possibly for its conquest. How realistic is that, though? How much of that is just Russia trying to deepen the rhetoric while Trump's looking the other way, as it were? Or is there a real threat of Russia somehow breaking through the lines and making another dash for Kyiv or something along those lines?
I mean, I wouldn't say it's always a risk, but there's always the potential that either we have not, or the Ukrainians have not, or even the Russians have not fully understood the situation, and that something unforeseen occurs. Now, I think it's quite unlikely at this stage that the Russians will just sort of surge through. They do seem to have been really, held up, and the amount of territories that they've taken over the last sort of year or so has been very limited. But nonetheless, it's generally been in their favour, even if it's inch by inch, kilometre by kilometre. The support that the major European powers and the United States have provided have really helped the Ukrainians, and also the Ukrainians have had their own internal defence industrial build-up and mobilisation, and there's more that they could do there as well. So there's always that risk, but of course the Kremlin, the Russians, they want to make it as almost as clear as day that they will inevitably prevail here, because it's a kind of psychological warfare that's going on, not even behind the scenes, but it's part of the war effort to discourage Europeans from providing support, from to discourage the Ukrainians from fighting, because eventually the Russian narrative is that Russia will prevail, and that's always part of a protagonist's war objectives, to try and discourage the enemy from fighting because of the inevitability of their defeat. But of course, this isn't, in this case, in an objective world, necessarily inevitable that the Ukrainians will be defeated, particularly if we step up and provide more support.
Well, James Rogers from the Council of Geostrategy, thank you very much for joining me today on Frontline.
Thank you.